This is Lived Avodah. In this series, we will explore the lives, Avodah, an inner world of Chassidim who sought to live with Pnimius and emes. Picture the Zal and Timchi Timimim late at night. The Bachram are asleep, and not on beds, on benches. The same benches they learned on during the day, that's where they slept at night. The room is dark, the yeshiva is poor, and there's just a little candlelight. And there's one bacher still sitting by a sefer, Reb Itche. His body is tired, his eyes want to close. He brings a basin of ice-cold water, takes off his shoes and socks, and puts his feet into the water and keeps learning. Not because someone is watching, and not because he wants a story told about him one day, because as long as there's a little koyach left, he wants to learn Torah. And when the other Bachrim see that he's starting to collapse from exhaustion, they quietly come over and blow out his candle. Because if the candle is still burning, Reb Itche will keep learning. This is how Chassidim came to know him. Reb Itche Der Masmid. His given name was Reb Horowitz. He was born in the year 1890, Tafresh Nun, in Nahar Tov or Brezne-Uvate, to his father Reb Shlomo Menachem Mendel and his mother Elka. But among Chassidim, the name that remained was not Reb Horowitz. It was Reb Itche Der Masmid. But the beginning of the story is important, because people like to imagine that such a person was simply born that way. A special child, a prodigy, a holy neshama, and therefore there's nothing to learn from him. He was he, and we are we. But those who knew his early years said otherwise. His greatness was not handed to him. His father was a simple melamed, his mother an orphan who could not even read aleph beis. He grew up in a house where people didn't look at him and say, "This boy is destined for greatness." He worked. As a child, Yitzchak was a small, underdeveloped for his age. People often thought he was younger than he really was. But inside this small body, there was tremendous hunger. Not for food, not for attention, and not for childish things. A hunger for Torah. There was once a kind of bet between him and another boy. They wanted to see who could learn longer, who could push themselves more, who could prepare for smicha. The other boy eventually became weak, but Yitzchak continued. And at the age of 14, he got smicha. And from then on, people started looking at him differently. They labeled him Der Masmid. People realized it wasn't just his natural brilliance. He forced himself into it. He took his kochos and he used them. He pushed, he demanded, he didn't let himself drift. And this is how the young Yitzchak began. He was a small boy in a small colony, but he had a fire in him and it didn't let him rest. After his bar mitzvah, Yitzchak began asking his parents to let him go away for yeshiva. In the colonies, life was built to be self-sufficient. There was farming, trade, religious life, community, but the big yeshivas were in the cities. The serious Bachrim wanted to grow and to leave home. Yitzchak wanted to go as well. Eventually, he came to Timchi Timimim, to the yeshiva of the Rebbe Rashab. There, a new chapter began. Until then, he was known as someone that knew Torah, someone that was masmid, someone that knew what it meant to sit and learn. But in Timchi Timimim, he entered a whole new world, the world of Chassidus. Not as an idea, as a good vart, but as a way of life. The Bachrim there were not only learning Gemara, they were working on themselves. They were learning Chassidus, thinking Chassidus, davening with Chassidus. There was warmth, there was chayes, there was a different kind of seriousness. For the first time, Yitzchak saw Bachrim his own age spending hours in his mesirus, preparing for davening and trying to refine their midas. The rigorous learning of Torah was not pushed aside. It was deepened. It was given a heart. In Timchit Mimim, Reb Itche began to absorb the avodah of Chassidus. One idea especially took hold of him: iskafia. He began to train himself to eat only what was necessary, to sleep only what was necessary, to avoid pleasures for its own sake. Not only forbidden things, but also mutardike things. If they were not needed for Avodas Hashem, he worked to hold himself back from them. People thought perhaps Reb Itche was simply born or moved from the world. Maybe food and sleep did not interest him. But that wasn't true. Really, he struggled. It wasn't that he didn't have a guf. It was that he had a guf, but he didn't let his guf have the final word. Reb Itche was not floating above the world. He was fighting inside it. One of the strongest stories about Reb Itche happened years later in Kherson during a frightening time. There was unrest in the streets, rioting, danger, curfews. It was not safe to be outside at night. On Yud Kislev, Chassidim gathered to verbring in honor of the Gula of the Middle Rebbe. So they came before the curfew began in order to stay there all night. The table was simple. There was bread, herring, potatoes, pickles, samashke, a Chassidish verbringen, nothing fancy. So Reb Itche was there. But at some point in the middle of the verbringen, Reb Itche said that he didn't leave shul for 4 days and he was close to fainting. He didn't have anything to eat. Chassidim began to worry. The only bread that Reb Itche would eat would be the bread baked in the house of Rabbi Yaakov Plotkin. Now, because of the curfew, the bread was outside of the shul in the Plotkin home. So Reb Itche called over Bacher and asked him to bring his bread. The Bacher protested. He said, there's a curfew. Anyone going outside could be killed. So Reb Itche poured him a cup of mashke and told him, make a bracha. And Reb Itche gave him a bracha that Hashem's going to help you and you're not going to be harmed. So the Bacher was ready to go. But Reb Dvaskin, a staff member in yeshiva, stopped him and he said, your safety is my responsibility. I can't allow you to go. So a small group of Chassidim gathered. What should they do? Reb Itche was weak. He needed to eat something. Sending the Bacher outside will be dangerous. So someone suggested an idea. There was other bread in another room in a different house. Maybe we could just get that bread in order to save his life. Maybe the Bacher can hide for a short while and return and have that Bacher bring that bread. So, under normal circumstances, nobody would dare fool Reb Itche. But this is not normal circumstances. They felt it's his sakanas nefesh. They're saving his life. That's what the Bacher did. He returned with the loaf. So Reb Itche was very happy. He prepared washing for his bread. So he inspected his hands, his fingers, his nails, and he washed carefully. Then he stopped. He looked at the Bacher and asked, tell me, is this really my bread? The Bacher said, yeah. So Reb Itche says, okay, if so, I believe you. He prepared again, he washed again, began to say a bracha over the bread. His face was burning with concentration. Then, just before cutting the bread, he froze again. He stood deep in thought. The room became silent, and Reb Itche fainted from hunger. Reb Itche was also known for his care in mitzvahs and hidurim. If there was a way to do a mitzvah with more care, more beauty, more caution, he wanted that. Once someone complained to the Rebbe about Reb Itche's behavior. They felt that Reb Itche was going a little too far, and he said, well, does Reb Itche think he's more pious than the Rebbe? Even the Rebbe doesn't chase such hidurim. So the Rebbe responded with a smile, and perhaps this was true, but no one was capable of rebuking Reb Itche for his piety. His care for mitzvahs was especially visible in the baking of shmura matzah. When Reb Itche would come to the bakery before Pesach, everyone knew things would slow down. He inspected the premises, he checked the tools, he watched the oven, he checked the flour, he sifted. He insisted that all the workers be Shem Shabbos. He required their perforations in the matzah to be made with wood rather than metal. If someone spoke while working with the dough, the matzah was removed. Every matzah had to be watched. Every step mattered. Once a worker joked that the oven was not hot enough. So Reb Itche took the comment seriously, stopped the entire production so that the oven could be stoked again. Because for Reb Itche, baking matzah before Pesach wasn't just something you did. It was a holy, holy mitzvah. Despite the respect he received, despite the way Chassidim viewed him, he didn't carry himself like as an important person. He was once invited to lead a fabrengen in a certain shul, and when he entered, everybody stood up. Reb Itche was horrified. He motioned for everybody to sit down. He was visibly pained. Someone tried to joke around and say, "How do you know they stood up for you? Maybe they stood up for somebody else." Reb Itche took it seriously. He replied, "You're correct. My humility is lacking. Why did I assume that they stood up for me? There are many holy people here. And if I was more truthful with myself, I would realize this immediately." That night, the entire topic of the fabrengen was about humility. And he explained that true humility comes from emes, comes from truth. A person has to know what is coming from the Yetzer Hara, what is coming from the Yetzer Tov. Chassidus, he says, gives the person the ability to sort all of this out. People would gather for hours to hear him speak. The food was simple, a little herring, a little mashke. The main thing was the atmosphere. He would explain Chassidus, and the Chassidus he explains was pushed towards the idea of avodah. Not just what the concept means, but what it's asking from a person. There was a story that someone once asked a respected mashpia why all the elderly mashpiim and chassidim would sit quietly by the Reb Itche's fabrengens. Usually by fabrengens, chassidim would speak, ask, challenge, argue a little, but by Reb Itche, they sat like school children before a teacher. The mashpia answered, Reb Itche was not a regular person. He was viewed as an extension of the Rebbe. This is how chassidim saw him. Not because he himself demanded it, he did not, but because they felt that when he spoke, he didn't speak from ego. And the Rebbe put him as his shliach to spread Chassidus around the world. But perhaps the deepest impression he made was through his davening. Reb Itche's preparation for davening began early. He would wake up around 6 o'clock, choose a Maimer Chassidus to learn, and he would learn it slowly with concentration, sometimes for many hours. He would walk back and forth in shul with his talus over his shoulder, thinking Chassidus. His face would shine with intensity, and only after long preparation he would begin davening. And once he began, each word would come slowly, with a niggin, with kavanah. People could see that he wasn't just saying words, he was inside them. As davening continued, Reb Itche became less and less aware of the world around him. Once, while davening, he ended up in the shul's kitchen. The cooks were shouting because hot oil was splashing onto him, and he was so absorbed in tefillah that he didn't even feel it. Often, especially on short winter days, his hiskashrus lasted so long that he would daven mincha right afterwards. Even though the minyan finished long before, he preferred to daven in shul. He would say, learning in shul goes better, and davening in shul goes better. Whenever Reb Itche had to serve as chazan, people knew it wouldn't be simple. Once he had a yard set in Kremenchuk. He asked permission from the mashgiach, Reb Kuznetsov, to daven before the Yamid for the yeshiva bachrim. The mashgiach knew him well, and he knew that once Reb Itche started davening, time didn't exist for him. The mashgiach didn't want to agree. Until Reb Itche begged him, said, Bli neder, I'll daven very quickly. Eventually, the mashgiach agreed. So when Reb Itche started davening, that bli neder did not keep. During davening, he left the amud and stood in a corner. His hands were raised up. He was singing Chassidish nigunim, davening b'dveikos. The room was filled with yira. The bachrim sat quietly and waited. Eventually, Reb Kuznetsov went over to him, took him gently by the hand, and led him right back to the amud. Another time, he knew that yeshiva would not let him be chazan, so Reb Itche went to a local shul. He tried to daven quickly. For Ma'ariv, he managed, but Shachris, he was so bedvekos, especially during Shema, that people didn't know what to do. So they waited until the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Cheskel Heimelstein, walked in and understood what had happened. He walked over to Reb Itche, touched him gently, and whispered, "Itche, everyone is waiting for you. Make it faster." That was Reb Itche's davening. It wasn't measured by a clock. It was measured by where the person was standing inside. Reb Itche would often say by Fabrengens, the physical world is animated by Elikus, and a person must keep this in mind when looking at the world. Everything is godliness. He would say that a healthy heart is a heart that understands Elikus, a heart that beats with actual ahava and yira of Hashem. He said that since Hashem exists, man does not really exist, and that this knowledge alone should make a person tremble. He would speak about gradual growth, warning people not to jump too quickly into levels they have not earned. A person beginning with chassidus must move with seder, not imagination. After all of the light of chassidus that Reb Itche was spreading, came the final darkness. The war reached Latvia. The Nazis took control, and Jewish life in Riga was crushed with terrible speed. Jews were forbidden to leave their homes at certain hours. They were given lower rations. They had to wear identifying marks on their clothing. They were forbidden from public transportation, from walking freely, from attending school. Their money and valuables were taken. Torah schools were desecrated. Jews were forced into ghettos. More than 23,000 local Jews, including Reb Itche, were ordered into the Riga ghetto, and they were imprisoned behind fences and guarded barriers. The conditions were horrific. Crowding, hunger, fear, poverty. Food rations were given only to those working, and then they had to support the children and the elderly. Reb Itche was trapped together with his fellow chassidim, including Reb Chaim and Reb Chaim Altais. There had been efforts to save them. The Frierdiker Rebbe, already in America, had worked to arrange visas for Reb Itche and other chassidim stranded in Riga. Telegrams were sent. Plans were made. There was a possibility of escape. But the efforts came too late. The situation tightened. The Nazis blocked the way out. The visas could no longer save them. From the ghetto, Reb Itche wrote to a former student. He wrote that he was living in Riga under horrific conditions, and that words could not properly describe what they were experiencing. He wrote that perhaps it had been a mistake not to return to Russia, but now it was too late. And soon after, on Yud Kislev, Tafshin Beis, Reb Itche was caught in another Nazi roundup. The Nazis gathered Jews in the Reisher Minyanim Shul in Riga. Hundreds of horrified Jews were forced to stand outside and watch. Nazis sprayed kerosene over the building. They opened the windows so that the fire would spread. Inside the burning shul was Reb Itche. He was wearing a torn tallis and broken tefillin. As the flames began to rise, Reb Itche walked to the Aron Kodesh and took out a Sefer Torah. His voice rang out as he made the bracha, thanking Hashem for the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. Then he pressed the Torah to his chest, and together with Reb Chaim Altais and Reb Chaim, he began dancing in a small circle and singing the tune of Hakafis. The flames spread through the shul, the walls burned, the furniture turned to ash. Screams and cries mixed with the sound of their singing. And this was the last image of Reb Itche Der Masmid, a Chossid holding a Sefer Torah, dancing, singing, going to his death al Kiddush Hashem. Hashem Yikum Domam. It's hard to finish a story like this, because Reb Itche was not one story. He was a whole life. He was a boy from Nahar Toiv who made himself into a masmid, a bacher in Timchet Mimim, with his feet in ice water, learning by a candlelight, an Ovid working on a skafia, a Chossid who would not eat bread if something inside it smelled sheker, a Yid whose davening would carry him beyond the shul. He was a man who spoke of loving Hashem simply and quietly, and in the end, he was a Yid holding the Sefer Torah in the flames. But a story of a Chossid should leave a person with something, even a small thing, anything we can learn from him. A little more emes, a little more seriousness in davening, a little more care in doing mitzvahs, a little less surrender to the guf, a little more longing to Hashem. Reb Itche Der Masmid showed what a human being can become when Torah and Chassidus were not only learned, but lived. Even a small spark from such a fire can warm a cold heart.